What's going on, guys? MakerMods here, back at it again with another new video. Today we're taking a look at a new switch from Gateron, the Oil Kings. I say new, but the most exciting part of this switch comes from a switch we've seen before, the black ink. The Oil King uses a proprietary plastic blend made famous by their ink line of switches, which are popular for both smoothness and a deep sound signature. I bought mine from Prevail Kiko, but they're starting to trickle into different vendors like JWICK, thoccy, and even on AliExpress. Let's get started. The Oil King is a 5-pin linear switch with a nylon PA66 top, an ink bottom, and a palm stem. It uses a 20mm spring that's rated at 55 grams actuation with an 80 gram bottom out. There are a couple new design choices that I wanted to point out. First, the Gateron logo on the top housing is flipped or upside down, apparently due to a new mold and tooling that Gateron is using for 2022. According to Thermangoat, the flipped logo is being used on switches that are using Gateron's new and improved lubing technique, but we'll talk about the lube in a second. As for the bottom housing, one point that I was pleased to note was that unlike Black Ink V1s, these ink bottoms don't have an issue with loose switch pins. Lastly, the springs are black, which I haven't seen before. There isn't too much other info on them, like whether they're Korea made or what steel was used, but the springs are way better than the ones used in Ink V2s and they have very little noise. So let's talk about the lube. According to the sales page, the Oil King comes lightly factory lubed. Here you can see that the switch has an oil coating on the bottom housing rails and the stem sliders. I didn't find any other noticeable lube points, but in my batch of 110 switches, the lubing was pretty inconsistent. Here I grabbed the random sample of 5 stock switches, and there's a pretty noticeable range in the sound and feel based on the amount of lube that was applied. Here's one that was pretty typical for most of the switches. Now here's one that sounds and feels way over lubed in comparison. When I opened up the switches, I was pretty shocked at the variance in lube quality and quantity, as some were dripping all over the bottom housing, which definitely contributes to a more muted sound. The overlubed switches also had a lot more spillage into the top housing itself. Overall, I'd say the properly lubed switches are smooth, but they don't sacrifice sound, while the overlubed switches are more on the muted side. I did check out Thermangoat's review while I was planning my video. If you haven't read it, I'd highly recommend checking it out if you're planning or thinking about buying these switches. And I was surprised to see that at least on his review batch, he praised the factory lube job from Gateron as excellent both in terms of switch-to-switch consistency as well as per-switch smoothness. While I'll agree that all the switches are smooth, the variance in the amount of lube meant that on around 10 to 15 of the 65 or so that I lubed for this video, I had to clean off what I consider to be excess lube. Ironically, Thermangoat had the opposite experience, where he felt that 1 in 10 were under-lubed. Now, I don't want you to dismiss these switches because of the factory lube. Overall, these switches are very decent. It's just one thing I wanted you to note so that you can make a fully informed buying decision. If you aren't planning on modding these switches, I'd make sure to pick up a few extras just in case. Before we go any further, I wanted to discuss a question I had as soon as these switches were announced. Can you Frankenswitch a KS3 Gateron top and an ink bottom to make what's basically an Oil King? Here is a single switch sound test of the Oil King. Now here's the Frankenswitched version. So as a loose switch, they sound pretty similar, but I do have to say that the Oil King has a slightly deeper frequency sound as compared to the Frankenswitch version. I think you can attribute that to the fact that the black ink has a translucent bottom, whereas the Oil King has an opaque bottom. Also, considering the fact that black ink is more expensive than an Oil King just on its own, I don't think I can really recommend making these Frankenswitches unless you already have all the switches lying around. So let's go to the sound tests. I wanted to include a quick single switch comparison between various popular linears so you can get an idea of how this switch compares to other similar switches. Let me know in the comments if this next section is helpful for you or if you think I can skip it moving forward. All the switches are stock using the same SA profile keycap. Here's a stock Oil King. Cherry MX Black. C3 equals Tangerine. Gateron Black Ink V2. KS3 Yellow. Novelkeys cream. Cream is smaller. And last, a JWICK. And one more time for good measure. Next, let's go to the typing test. The board is my usual tester board, the TX60V1, which uses an FR4 and aluminum plate. The keyboard is Tempest modded with one layer of 3M blue painter's tape and Dynamodded with one layer of Dynamat. Now let's talk about modding the switch. Normally I use Krytox 205G0 on my linear switches, but because the Oil King is factory lubed, I lubed over it with a very light coat of Tribosis 3204. I also made sure to soak up any spillage from the factory lube using a clean brush for better consistency. I've also been having good results lubing noisy springs with GPL 106, which is slightly more viscous than 105. Because these springs weren't noisy to begin with, I just did a quick brush while I was putting them back together. I also filmed the switches with desk key films. Here's the sound test. So overall, the Oil Kings come in at 65 cents per switch before promo codes and shipping. That puts it at the same price as Tangies and Creams and 10 cents cheaper per switch than Black Inks. JWICKs and KS3 Yellows are around 25 to 30 cents per switch, and the Old Faithful Cherry MX Black is usually around 50 cents per switch. So are they worth it? I think overall, these switches are kind of like Haagen-Dazs chocolate ice cream. Yes, there are fancier flavors like Rocky Road or Fudge Brownie. Yes, there are fancier brands like Talenti Gelato or those random creameries that you can only find at Whole Foods that cost like $10 for a pint. Yes, Breyer's slow churn chocolate tastes almost as good for half the price. But Haagen-Dazs chocolate ice cream is good. It's smooth, and sometimes you can find it on sale, which makes it an insta-buy. The Oil King isn't as exciting as all the new long pull linear switches that have come out recently, and there isn't anything special in terms of sound or even the feel. But the bottom line is, it's a very good switch that in my opinion sounds better than the Black Inks at a lower price. I wouldn't hesitate to buy these again, especially if you are already considering Black Inks for their sound signature. Well, that's gonna be it for me today, guys. If you made it this far, I'd really appreciate it if you could like the video. If you didn't like the video, let me know in the comments below how I can make better content for you to enjoy. Thanks once again, I love you, I'm MakerMods, and I'll catch you in the next video.